As Lara explained there, I have the privilege of sharing with all of you the first preview that's been seen outside of Abacus of the 2017 Home Shopping Trends Report. Now, this is a report that over the years we've run, and based on the feedback that we've received from all of you, we know the value of the content for your sort of strategic planning for the year ahead. So it was really important for us to be able to provide you with some of those key trends so you can take that away today and start to use that in your planning for the rest of 2017. So over the next 20 minutes, we will cover a couple of things, or a variety of things rather. So firstly, we'll look at what's going to be included in the overall report. Then we'll have a look at some economic trends and try and put the trends that I'm going to talk about here into a little bit more context for you. Then we'll look at how the report is compiled and then the actual trends themselves, so how 2016 compared to 2015 in terms of revenue and in terms of mailing volumes. Then we'll look at how you can compare your own business's trends against that of your competitive category, something that I know was really interesting for people after the event last year, so we'll talk about how you can do that. And then I wanted to leave everybody with some ideas about 2017, so some of it will be speculation, but it's all based on opinions out there in the marketplace, so some ideas that might be interesting to take into your strategy for this year as well. So we've been running this report now for about 7 years, Lara, something like that. So our goal is always to make it bigger and better than it ever has been. So Michaeli and Luke and others back in the office are sort of working tirelessly to make sure that we include not just the trends, but also the information that supports those trends, what's actually causing those to happen, and including additional bits of information that can help to frame what we're actually showing on the graphs. So this year we hope is going to be no different. We hope this will be the biggest and best that we've ever produced. So it will include the home shopping trends for 2016 and how that compared to the year before, but it'll also include interviews from members of the audience, I think, so industry leaders and how you've seen and your businesses have seen the challenges last year and how you've adapted to those. We'll also include an economic review from Step Solutions, again, to try and frame the trends that we're showing you here for our corner of the retail market, and an overview from the Met Office of the impact that weather has. And I think a lot of you in the room, particularly those who work for gardening businesses and clothing businesses, obviously see the impact of weather quite acutely. So being able to understand how you can plan your strategy around what the weather might do, without obviously 100% certainty, is obviously interesting. So that's included too. And the whole report will be available at the end of next month. So rest assured that as and when that's available, you'll all be made aware of how you can get hold of a copy for yourselves. So, the economic review. Now, I know some of you, and Lara mentioned earlier, that we had capital economics here last year at the same event. So I'm not a professional economist, which is why there's only 3 bullet points up there. But I think it's important to just spend a couple of moments thinking about the UK economy last year. And actually, Lara has done a lot of this work for me in her introduction to today. But it does frame what we're seeing, as I said a minute ago, for our corner of the retail market. So despite all the uncertainty that surrounded us politically in the UK last year, GDP grew by 2%. Consumer spending actually grew by 3.1%. And when you compare that to 2015, consumer spending actually dipped by 0.1%, so it was pretty much flat in 2015. But last year we saw a growth of 3.1%, despite everything that was going on. And the most exciting thing, and again, Lara's mentioned this, but it's so great to see that for our corner of the market, for all of us in the room, what we want to know is that the direct-to-consumer market is in good shape. Last year's growth, not only can you see what the figure was there, 15.4%, that is more than double what it was in 2015. So it's actually a really exciting sector within retail that we're all part of. So very briefly, I won't go into the detail. Michaeli last year probably did a much better job than I'm going to do of explaining how the report is compiled. But essentially, the Abacus Alliance is comprised of 21 different retail categories. And you can see the majority of them up here. What we've done for this report is aggregated a number of those to create 6 key macro categories. And those are the categories we'll be reporting on here. In terms of the data that's included in that, so we have to have transactional data from every brand whose data is going into this from the 1st of January 2015 through till the 31st of December last year. And we needed to have had that in time for when the analysis started to be run last month. And the last thing to say is you will see there are mailing volume trends on the graphs. That doesn't come from Abacus, that comes from a business called Ubiquity, who basically measure the volume of direct mail pieces that are landing on UK household doorsteps each year. Right, so into the good stuff. Starting with clothing. I know there's a number of clothing retailers with us today. So this is traditionally a really successful category. So the 5-year average for clothing in terms of revenue growth has been 13.3%. So it's been a category of growth for 5 consecutive years. That was no different in 2016 with growth of 8%. Now obviously that's a little bit lower than the 5-year average and a little bit lower than what it was last year, which was 10.7%. But it's still great to see that, again, thinking of everything that went on last year, there was an 8% growth in this category. If we look at the strongest month, October was up 18% year on year. And in terms of the sort of quarterly trends, I think a particular one to pay attention to was the fact that Q4 was significantly stronger than it was last year. I think there's a couple of things to, again, some of this is speculation to an extent, but it's based on opinion that we see out there in the marketplace. And it'd be interesting to know after this whether you guys agree with this or think it's complete rubbish. But there was a trend in the clothing space last year of consumers coming from overseas to purchase in the UK because of the lowering value of the pound. But also, weather conditions changed last year. So actually, if you remember the relatively balmy temperatures, spelled either way, of 2015, when we had that really warm September, October, November, and people just weren't buying coats and jackets, etc. Last year, we had a 3.3 degrees Celsius cooler November and a 2 degrees Celsius cooler October. So actually, people were much more in the marketplace for the sorts of stuff that you would have expected them to buy at that time of year. Mailing volumes stayed more or less the same as last year, but there was a few things to mention. So you can see on the graph here that, what am I trying to say here? So there was a small dip just before June. So the referendum potentially caused people to pull mailings forward a little bit to stay away from, obviously, that period of particular uncertainty. The mailing volumes towards the end of the year actually slightly dipped compared to 2015. And that possibly was just the beginnings of the increase in cost associated with print materials and product being acquired from overseas. But all in all, a good year for clothing. And as I mentioned, this report, like last year, contains a number of interviews from industry leaders, as I said, people in the room. And Nick from Peter Christian, who are a menswear brand, had this to say about how Brexit impacted, or actually didn't really impact their business. So in May and June, when the referendum campaigns kicked into gear big time, sales went flat. But then in autumn, all of a sudden the nation seemed to wake up, dust themselves down and say, hang about, the world hasn't fallen off a cliff here, we can carry on a bit. And I think that was certainly indicative of other trends in other categories that we'll talk about as we go through. Gardening is a really interesting one, and if clothing is one that historically has been very successful year on year the last few years, gardening is one that has found it tougher, and that's no doubt in part because of the vulnerability that this category faces from prevailing weather conditions. But if you look at the trends here, it still grew by 5.5% last year, which is fantastic when you consider that Q1 in 2016 was probably one of the wettest first parts of the year that we've had for a very long time. And in fact, January last year was the 4th wettest January since 1910. And we had 148% of average rainfall in that month. And February wasn't much drier, so 128% of average rainfall in that month. So that goes a long way, I think, to explaining why we can see the revenue dropped at the beginning of last year, and the mailing volumes dropped. So you can see the light green bar and the dark green bar. You can see for January and February in particular, that dark green bar is significantly lower than the light green bar. So it represents decline in those 2 months. And mailing volumes obviously copied that because you guys weren't so willing to put things out into the mail. But then equally, the weather then has a positive impact on Q2 because consumers that have been holding back on their purchases whilst the weather was awful then decided to make those once it started to perk up, and a particularly warm spring also helped that trend. And a warm autumn also contributed to the fact that the whole year saw 5.5% growth. And Vicky from Thomson & Morgan actually gave another Brexit-oriented perspective on the gardening market. And she said that Brexit has not really had a major impact. A lot of what we sell is relatively low ticket, so things like this have less of an effect than they would on a bigger purchase item, something that's taken a bit more thought and consideration. So an interesting dynamic to think about there in terms of the type of business that potentially would have been affected by the referendum last year. Food and wine is a really interesting category. So the growth here was significant, and you can see that year on year, the food and wine category grew by 23.4% in terms of revenue, compared to 17.5% the year before. So it was already an incredible growth category, and that's kicked on in 2016, particularly towards the back end of the year. So there was growth in every month, but Q4 2016 saw nearly 30% growth in revenue. There's a few things to say about what might have caused that. Before I suggest those, you'll see there are no mailing volumes here. That's because Ubiquity don't capture sufficient volume of information to give us a statistically valid read to be able to include those in the graph. So what caused this? So I think certainly the spike towards the back end of the year is indicative of the fact that for the festive period, people are much more likely to go out and make sort of larger basket orders, cases of wine, whatever it might be, compared to the rest of the year when they're just going to their local shop or supermarket to pick things up ad hoc. But also I think the food and wine category is a really interesting one because it's an area where people are becoming much more comfortable buying direct from specialist retailers. And actually, people are much more concerned about the quality and the origin of food that they're buying, and obviously drink as well. So I think that explains why we're seeing more and more brands out there in the marketplace now catering to time poor, cash rich individuals who actually are starting to think a lot more about what they eat and drink. So perhaps that could go a long way to explaining why this is such an exciting growth category. Gifts and gadgets, growth yet again. So 7.9% in 2016, about 3 or 4% down on what we saw in 2015. But again, potentially difficult trading conditions last year, so great to see that. The strongest month was actually April, so we saw nearly 30% growth in the month of April. That went a long way to salvaging what was a dreadful January. So they saw, the category saw 34% decline in January. So obviously didn't start the year off in the best possible way, and there was some ground to be made up, but the category certainly did that over the course of the year. In terms of mailing volumes, the general trend was that the first half of the year people were mailing more. Second half of the year seemed to be stagnant, if not a little bit less compared to 2015. The interesting thing to mention about this category is if you look at November, every single month across the other categories, every single November across the other categories showed growth. And I think all of us in the room are familiar with the phenomenon that is Black Friday and the fact that that's very much part of all of our marketing strategies to some extent these days. But this is interesting because actually it suggests that the impact of Black Friday, whilst it drives more sales, might not necessarily drive more profit. So whilst the other categories didn't see that, gifts and gadgets did, and that could be one of the reasons why. And lastly, home interiors, another good news story, 9.2% growth. Again, about 3 or 4% growth, or 3 or 4% down growth-wise than 2015. strongest month was April, but January was also particularly strong, and then the back end of the year was particularly strong. Mailing volumes were a little higher in the first half of the year, particularly in the first quarter, and we can see that the April activity was down, and that was probably because Easter was significantly earlier last year, so home interiors brands were pulling forward their campaigns. The thing to notice here is that these trends pretty much corroborate the assertions of home interiors businesses that I know I've spoken with, who say that early in the new year and then from late summer onwards tend to be their key seasons. So that's very much what we're seeing here. So in summary, I won't go through all of those, but basically, as you can see, every single category saw growth in 2016. And I'll say it again, we think about the conditions, the trading conditions that we experienced last year, it's not bad going. And you can see the individual months where growth was seen most acutely. So, I mentioned at the start that one of the things that you can do as Abacus Alliance members is benchmark your own business's trends against that of your competitive category. It's free of charge, you don't need to provide any additional data, and we will interpret the results for you. If this is something that would be of interest to you guys, then do come and speak to me or your account manager over the course of today, and we can let you know how you can go about getting hold of that information. So lastly, I wanted to try and put 2017 into some sort of context as well, based on the opinions that are out there at the moment. So consumer confidence is high going into 2017. In terms of retail spend anyway, we've seen that 3.1% growth in 2016. And growth is forecast to continue for our corner of the market, so that direct-to-consumer corner of the market, which is great. However, it's certainly not all going to be peaches and cream this year. I think we know there are going to be some challenges ahead. And one of the most important ones is likely to be that this year is probably the year where the increased costs in acquiring product and print materials from overseas is going to have to start to be passed on to consumers. So what that means is consumers are obviously going to have to pay more for everyone's products, which means that actually consumer spend might well be a little bit restricted, or certainly people are going to be much more discerning about what they buy and who they buy from. Therefore, cut-through is going to become more important than ever in 2017. Getting your brand message heard, getting your products out in front of the right people. So if we think about the online marketing world and how competitive that is, and the number of online marketing messages that we see as consumers each week, there's hundreds of them that we get via display ads, email, Facebook, Twitter, whatever it might be. Now compare that to the number of well-targeted catalogues that land on your doorsteps each week. And we can see that catalogue is still a vital way, one of the best ways to drive cut-through and get your brand and your products in front of the right consumers. But the challenge this year is to make your catalogues, make your campaigns work harder than they ever have before because of that point about the increase in cost. So think about your targeting, think about your print, think about your postage. Talk to me or your account manager throughout today. Talk to Richard and Stuart from Webmart, who are speaking later on, and they are experts in print and postage. There's lots of great ways that you can mail more efficiently, whether it's postage discounts, whether it's a different type of catalogue, whatever it might be. So think about your options. And if you get one thing out of today, just make sure that you speak to your peers as well and find out the challenges that they're having and how they're overcoming it. And if you think about how you can be more efficient with your direct marketing in 2017, you're going to put yourself in a much better position to be able to weather these potentially tougher trading conditions that might be coming our way this year. And that's it. Thank you very much.